Tell me if this sounds familiar. You put on this cool looking new TV show while flipping through cable channels. Or more likely, you stumbled across it on Netflix, and you thought, oh, this looks like fun. But as you kept watching, you noticed a lot of details and questions in the story, mysterious things that don't really get explained. You continue on, hoping to find answers to these questions, but if anything, the story only gets more mysterious, with each answer only raising new questions. And the mysteries keep piling up until your brain starts to hurt keeping track of it all, and you get to the end and you're like, help, I need someone to explain this to me. Fortunately, that's why I'm here. Manifest is what I like to call a mystery box story, definition on screen, and I've dedicated myself to explaining as many of them as possible. If you have unanswered questions about the convoluted lore of a story you've just finished, then I'm the guy who can give you those answers. Then afterwards, I give each mystery box story a rating out of 10, using my 10 criteria for what makes mysteries like these fun and engaging. In this video, I'm going to attempt to give a comprehensive explanation of every single mystery and question you could possibly have about this story. So, let's fasten our seatbelts and try to figure out the plot of Manifest. Given my affinity for these kinds of shows, early marketing for Manifest caught my eye. The premise is a cool one. A passenger flight takes off and lands, but even though it only felt like a day for them, on the ground, years had passed. Hey, a supernatural mystery surrounding a plane, like Lost. And it's airing on network TV, but it looks to have a big budget and a big name producer attached, also like Lost. And it also features a wide ensemble cast of all kinds of different people, like Lost. And there's a kid who has an extra special connection to whatever the magic is, like, is this show just Lost? Did they just remake Lost? Okay, I'm mostly joking here, but yeah, this show is a lot like Lost. Lost was a pioneer of the mystery box genre, codifying a lot of its structure and tropes. But it also made a lot of huge mistakes. Airing on NBC in 2018, Manifest comes a lot later, after TV networks got a better idea of how to handle a serialized mystery like this. Let's hope that this show can learn from the mistakes of the past and improve on the formula. So I already mentioned the premise of the show. A bunch of passengers board Flight 828, take off, and land, only to find that 5.5 years have passed. That's the big question that drives the entire show. The main characters are Michaela Stone and her brother Ben, who were on the flight along with Ben's son Cal, and Sanvi, a cancer doctor. The show has all the typical drama you can expect from a premise like this. Michaela's fiancé Jared and Ben's wife Grace have moved on to new relationships in the time they've been gone, and Cal's twin sister Olive is now 5 years older than he is. But in addition to that, the supernatural elements of this event go a lot deeper. Soon after landing, the passengers start hearing voices, seeing visions, feeling things that compel them to do certain things. Ben names it the calling, and it generally seems to be a benign force. The characters don't always understand what it means right away, but it always seems to lead them to solve problems and help people. Most passengers experience callings, but Cal seems to have an extra special connection. He knows things that he couldn't possibly know, he forms a psychic link with one of the missing passengers in one episode, and he keeps making drawings that seem to predict the future. Michaela and Ben do some digging and coordinating with other passengers, and they find some kind of shady government involvement with the whole thing. Certain passengers that nobody would miss have disappeared since landing. Along with NSA agent Robert Vance, who acted as an antagonist in the first few episodes before he figured out what was going on, the main characters track the missing people to an underground facility in Brooklyn, and rescue the missing passengers. But this shady government stuff becomes sort of a recurring theme going forward. Michaela starts having visions of some guy in a snowstorm. Cal runs off, and as everybody runs to find him, he leads them to finding Snowstorm Guy. His name is Zeke, and he went hiking and came back a year later, falling through time in the same way as the 828 passengers. After that, a man named James Griffin comes back in the same way, after driving a truck over a bridge and jumping ahead 3 days. But then, he spontaneously dies of drowning exactly 3 days later. This seems to indicate that people who return from events like these only live the amount of time they were away, which means that all the 828 passengers will die 5.5 years from the day they returned, on June 2nd, 2024. And Zeke's death date is even earlier, 1 year from now. So, for a lot of Season 2, the passengers live with the knowledge of their supposed death date hanging over their heads, which really bums a lot of people out. What makes things worse is that Ben and Grace are expecting another kid, and because of that, Grace is now experiencing callings. Does the death date apply to the baby? Does it apply to Grace? This symbol of a peacock keeps popping up in the callings. Olive finds out that it's from a tarot card deck made by a man named Yusuf Al-Zuras, who lived hundreds of years ago and who appears to have experienced a disappearance like 828 and the others. Later, a calling lets them know that Al-Zuras saw Flight 828 when his ship disappeared, seeming to suggest that these disappearances bring everything to the same interdimensional space across time. Another dimension, outside of time. This weird shadow Cal drew early in the show starts taking on life of its own, stalking Cal in the form of 3 people. Those 3 people are 3 criminals Michaela arrested, who then break out of jail and kidnap Cal. But thankfully, Zeke has a calling and they find Cal. The criminals fall into a freezing lake, and Zeke stops dying. Zeke followed the callings, and he was spared from the death date. Season 2 ends with the reveal that the criminals' bodies were never recovered from the lake, implying that they vanished in the same way that the plane did. Plus, Ben has a calling of the plane exploding, and then some fishermen dredge up a broken tailfin of what looks to be part of the 828 plane. Season 3, Ben flies to Cuba to go see the piece of the plane. When he touches it, it zaps his hand and makes it glow. After returning it to government custody, we learn that the NSA had the tailfin, but it teleported itself into the ocean at the exact moment that Sanvi killed an evil government bigwig called the Major. Plus, the tailfin and the body of a murdered passenger both have markings consistent with being underwater for 5 years. Zeke, after beating the death date, no longer has callings, but he seems to have developed some kind of super empathy ability. As expected, the criminals float up out of the lake a few months later, and they start getting callings. This leads the least horrible one, Pete, to reconnect with Angelina, another 828 passenger that he knew when they were kids. The 3 of them disappeared and reappeared just like so many others, which means that they have their own death date. We know from what happened to Zeke versus Griffin that the criminals have to follow the callings and do good in order to survive. 2 of them do, but everyone discovers too late that because they were part of the same disappearance, their fates are tied together, and when one of them refuses to give up their criminal ways, all 3 of them die. This would seem to imply that if even one 828 passenger ignores the callings, all of them die, which is basically an impossible thing to achieve, but that won't stop them from trying. Vance heads a new revamped NSA research operation aimed at figuring out 828 called Eureka. They research the tailfin and a piece of driftwood with a similar chemical makeup that they believe is a piece of Noah's Ark. With Vance in charge and Sanvi working under them, it seems like the government is finally on the side of good, but they constantly shut out the passengers from what they're doing, and various callings keep indicating if there's bad stuff going on there behind the scenes. Testing the driftwood causes earthquakes all across New York, so Sanvi steals it and drops it into a volcanic fissure. Testing on the tailfin causes Cal to break out in serious burns, so Cal goes to Eureka to convince them to return the tailfin back to the ocean where they found it. And when they refuse, Cal touches the tailfin and disappears in a flash of light. Finally, the stones get Vance to drop the tailfin in the ocean, but this doesn't bring Cal back. Angelina had been more or less adopted by the Stone family at the beginning of the season, but she starts acting weirder and weirder. She becomes obsessed with Eden, Ben and Grace's new daughter, and after acting more and more unhinged, Grace kicks her out. But in Season 3's cliffhanger ending, Angelina breaks back into the Stone's house, kills Grace, and kidnaps Eden. As Grace lies dying, an older Cal appears and comforts her. Also, there's a brief vision of Bill Daly. I didn't mention him before. He's the pilot of 828, who we hadn't seen since Season 1, when he stole a plane and disappeared trying to replicate 828's disappearance. Season 4 opens with a 2-year time skip. Ben is driving himself crazy trying to find Eden and Angelina. They eventually do get Eden back, but Angelina escapes. Sanvi recovers Flight 828's black box, with recordings of all the callings. While researching this, Cal figures out that when he disappeared, he was transported back into the light from the storm, called the Divine Consciousness, where he met Bill Daly and Fiona Clark. He chose to return, even though it would mean losing his memory of everything he learned there. More callings tell us that the death date isn't just for the passengers. The end of the entire world is coming on that date. Sanvi finds the Major's research and discovers that she was using Sapphire to create callings with the passengers she kidnapped. Sanvi plans to replicate her experiments, but she needs a special Omega Sapphire. They find it, then Angelina steals it. She uses the Sapphire to send fake callings. Thankfully, Cal stops her and shatters the Sapphire. But then a piece of the Sapphire absorbs into Angelina's hand, and a bunch of lava and junk shoots up out of the ground. We keep hearing over and over that Cal is the Holy Grail, that he has the power to single-handedly save the entire lifeboat, somehow. But Cal's cancer comes back. Did I mention that before? Yeah, Cal has cancer. He's about to die, but then Zeke uses his powers to absorb the illness, and Zeke dies instead. Skipping ahead a few months, Michaela is grieving over Zeke when Zeke starts appearing to her from inside the Divine Consciousness. This is Zeke coming from the past, from when he got lost in that cave and disappeared, but he has all his memories from his entire life. It's confusing, I know. I'll get to that later. Captain Daly and Fiona come back, but they're in rough shape. And a bunch of things related to their return share trace with a passage in the Book of Revelations. Angelina thinks God wants her to kill them, so she orchestrates both of their deaths before they can tell us anything. In a rage, Ben injects her with a serum Sanvi made that removes callings, but instead, it removes everyone's callings, except for Cal, who still gets everyone's. The death date arrives. Everyone goes to the site where Sanvi threw the Noah's Ark piece. Cal disappears in glowing blue sapphire light, and the plane comes up out of the ground, and a bunch of volcanoes start erupting everywhere. They get on the plane and take off. A few passengers who were less than great explode into piles of ash, but everyone else flies into the glow, and they land back in 2013, in the time and place they would have landed if the plane didn't disappear. Then, everyone goes back to their normal lives, as if none of this had ever happened. Okay, more than usual, that summary was pretty incoherent, but that was the best I could do. This show is a lot. It's constantly throwing new supernatural events and unexplained happenings at you without much in the way of explainable details. It's a lot to keep track of, and you're not really meant to. Ben might keep meticulous notes of everything that's happened within the show, but if you try to do that yourself while you're watching, you'll drive yourself insane. You should see the first draft of the script for this video. It was a train wreck before I had time to sit down and parse through everything I did or didn't know. Speaking of not knowing, ending this show the way it did was a choice. The finale is very late on specific answers to any of the big questions the show was built around. I knew that we would never get everything answered, but I was hoping for a little more than this. Still, I think it's totally possible to tease out explanations for some of the show's mysteries, big and small.
What does it mean? I feel like I'm going crazy.
Let's start with a big question, the thing that underpins the entire story. Flight 828 vanished into thin air and reappeared 5.5 years later. What happened? And why did it happen? This is not something that the show answers explicitly, but the final season does imply a lot that we can infer. Let's start with the what question. What happened to the plane and the people on it? The plane entered the glow, the divine consciousness. Periodically, throughout history, there are individuals or groups of people who experience something that should kill them, but instead, they slip into this divine alternate dimension of sorts. They stay in there for an unspecified amount of time, and then return to the world as if no time had passed. They then will live for the amount of time that they were gone for. While they do, they will experience callings, visions that direct them towards morally good actions. Then, when their time runs out and their death date arrives, if they acted morally during that time, they will survive. But if they acted evil, they die. Now, the why. This seems to have all happened because the divine consciousness, God if you want to call it that, wants to test humanity. It wants to save some people who would otherwise die and point them in the general direction of a moral life to see what they do. We never get to talk to the divine consciousness and have them tell us that this is the reason, but everything we see, especially in the finale, heavily implies that all this was a test. But it wasn't just a test for them. Flight 828 was a test for all humanity. Sanvi makes that comment towards the end that the group of passengers represents a random sample of humanity that would be useful in determining how good the average person is.
We're just a bunch of random people. Some good, some bad.
A statistical sample for a divine experiment.
This was an experiment to figure out if humanity was worth keeping around. If the passengers failed the test, the divine consciousness would have wiped out the entire human race. But thankfully, they passed, and the divine consciousness rewarded them by rewinding time to when they disappeared to make up for all the time they had lost. Here's where things get a little murky. Besides Flight 828, there are other known people who have gone through this process. Zeke, James Griffin, the 3 meth dealers, and Al-Zuras and his crew. And maybe Noah's Ark? And we see different things happen to those other test subjects. There was no apocalypse that we know of with these other tests. When Zeke passed, he just continued to live. And also he developed empathy superpowers. When the others failed and died, they didn't doom humanity, life went on without them. Why the differences? Plus, if every test ended with a rewinding of time, then how would you explain these other tests happening within the 828 test timeline? You'd have a Russian nesting doll of paradoxes. Between 828 and Zeke, which is the normal result of passing this test? This is veering into speculation here, but I believe that 828 is the only test we see that actually mattered. The reason for every other test we see during the show was for the sole purpose of showing the passengers how the test works and what to expect, giving them a better idea of how to pass. Why else would Al-Zuras have a calling of Ben and Angelina? Maybe the Divine Consciousness has run other tests throughout history that determine the fate of all humanity, but all the ones we know about were just smaller pieces of the big 828 test. Okay, so that's the gist of how and why the story happened. It was the Divine Consciousness testing humanity. So then, what are the callings? And why do people get them? Well, I already mentioned that the callings were ways to nudge test subjects towards morally good actions. But where did they come from? And why did they take the forms that they did? The final season doesn't provide explicit answers about the mechanics of the callings, but it does give us a lot of information that allows us to infer the answers we need. So after Zeke dies, he appears to Michaela and explains that he is speaking to her from 2018, when he was in the glow. He tells us that time doesn't exist in the glow, and that he has memories of his entire life, even though 2018 Zeke hasn't experienced them yet. Then, Michaela triggers his first calling by repeating the phrase, "Find her."
Repeat after me, all right? Find her. Find her.
But I just kept repeating over and over, right out loud.
Find her.
We can combine this with the scene of Cal's conversation with Captain Daly and Fiona when he's in the glow for the second time. Cal says he'll lose his memory when he returns to the physical world, and this is exactly what happens when he, Daly, and Fiona all eventually do so. Between these two scenes, I think the implication is very clear. The callings are flashes of future memories that passengers retain after leaving the glow. When Flight 828 flew into that storm cloud, the plane entered the Divine Consciousness, and every passenger was suddenly able to see their entire future. In this moment, they understood everything that had happened or would ever happen to them. When they return to Earth, they don't get to keep those memories. Remember, this is a test, and that would be like giving them all the answers. If everyone knows exactly what they're supposed to do, what would be the point? So, the passengers lose these memories when they leave the glow. Except, every so often, the Divine Consciousness will allow them to access a little snippet of what they once knew to help them find the right path. This is why the callings take such an abstract form. Too much information, and the test becomes too easy. Instead, the callings usually prompt people with images and symbols that just show them what to look for. Images or symbols that either mean something to them already, or that they'll be able to find out in the world if they look. Every calling is solvable to the person it's meant for. It's all a matter of whether the person will choose to solve it, whether they have faith that following the calling is what they should do. The test of the Divine Consciousness is this. If you take a person, and you tell them doing these things will put more good in the world, without explaining how, will they do it? Or will they dismiss them and make excuses to ignore them, or use them for personal gain? Alright, now let's talk about the lifeboat theory. After seeing 2 out of 3 meth dealers show remorse, and all 3 of them still die, Ben becomes convinced that if even one person fails the test, they all fail and die. Was he right? Like all the best mystery box questions, the answer is yes and no. In the finale, the 11 worst people on the plane exploded into ash. They failed the test, but everyone else got to live. So no, it wasn't the case that one person could cause the whole thing to fail. However, the finale does imply that they were still being judged as a group. That Grim Reaper thing showed up seemingly with the intent to destroy them all, and it only goes away after the passengers shout at it and say that they did a good enough job. So it's not really a one person fails, everyone fails situation, but if a lot more people had been bad, they would have sunk the lifeboat for everyone else. Beyond just doing good though, part of the test is getting forgiveness for your mistakes. None of the passengers were perfect, that would be impossible. But the majority of passengers can still survive as long as they acknowledge their faults. Then, they need somebody else to forgive them, like Egan and Adrian, or they need to forgive themselves, like Sanvi and Michaela. These characters survived, while someone like Angelina, who regretted killing Grace but still thought everything else she did was justified, burned to ash. In short, in order to pass the test, a rough majority of passengers need to A. Be mostly good people, B. Feel regret for not being good all the time, and C. Forgive themselves and or each other for their mistakes. Otherwise, the Grim Reaper dust thing would kill them all. Okay, so those are all the details of the Divine Consciousness test. But like, what is the Divine Consciousness exactly? Is it God? I'll approach this question in 2 different ways. First, mythological explanations. Yeah, in every way that matters, the Divine Consciousness is God. Maybe not the Christian God, but it's the intelligent force that guides the universe. I hesitate to label it with any real-world mythological terms. In the show, it's described as similar to the Judeo-Christian God, but that's more because the characters all live in a Christianity-dominated society, and that's how they all naturally approach it. Beyond that, any specific ties it has to any real-world religions is more about pointing passengers towards themes and ideas than any statement on what god this is. For example, the divine consciousness leads Ben and Olive toward the story of Ma'at balancing souls against a feather, not because it is the goddess Ma'at, but because it wants to tell the passengers to forgive each other to make their souls lighter. Likewise, the divine consciousness kept showing everybody images of peacocks because peacocks are a popular symbol of resurrection in many cultures, which led the passengers to figure out what happened to them on the plane and why. The divine consciousness is ultimately an extremely powerful force that resembles the gods of various religions, but in the universe of the show, no one religion is deemed the correct interpretation. But that's just one angle. Manifest also encourages a scientific approach to understanding this thing. After all, this might look like magic, but magic is just science you don't understand yet, right? So, here's a rundown of every scientific discovery that various characters make about the divine consciousness. First, there's Sapphire. Everywhere the divine consciousness goes, everything it touches, it leaves behind traces of sapphire, or at least the chemical compounds that make up sapphire. If you have an Omega Sapphire, you can communicate with the divine consciousness directly, like Cal does with his dragon tattoo made of sapphire. Or you can even imitate the divine consciousness by sending fake callings like Angelina does. And the Major tried to use Sapphire on passengers to induce more callings, except all it did was lock them in an endless state of calling from which they could never wake up. There's also Dark Lightning, a high-energy substance that is found in and around the glow. Scientists also discover that the callings come from when people receive a signal from an ultra-low frequency, nicknamed the God frequency. And you can hear callings in this frequency on recordings in the plane's black box. The frequency is also what causes all the earthquakes. Fiona Clarke's controversial theory about how all human brains are connected seemed to have been proven partially true as the series went on, as we saw several instances of passengers' brains linking up. Speaking of brains, callings do cause a measurable effect on the brain, to the point where machines can tell whether someone is having one by the final season. The show draws in more scientifically minded audience members with the idea that there can be a rational explanation for everything we see. But ultimately, the story ends up leaning pretty hard into the religion side of things. Scientific investigation only ever gives us surface level information, and whenever scientists try to run experiments or use anything they've learned for selfish reasons, the divine consciousness sends earthquakes as a warning. It's made clear that the passengers are meant to survive by having faith in the callings, not by logicking their way into salvation. What was so special about Cal? From the very beginning, Cal had more powerful callings than anyone else, and seemed to have more of a direct line to the divine consciousness. Why? Why was he the Holy Grail? The show never confirmed much about Cal's powers, so unfortunately I'll have to speculate here. One thing we know for sure is that some of Cal's abilities come from him being imbued with Sapphire. At the beginning of Season 4, Cal got his dragon scar, and took some Sapphire into his body. And since, as we've established, Sapphire can connect you to the divine consciousness, Cal's powers went into overdrive. He could see everyone's callings, he could mind link with Angelina, and he could act as a beacon to call the divine consciousness down and begin Judgment Day. But that only explains what he could do in Season 4. What about everything he could do before then? My best guess is that it's a combination of 1, Cal is a purely good and wholesome kid, and that makes him more connected to the divine, and 2, in scenes that flash back to the plane, we see that Cal looked out his window and was the only passenger who saw the glow directly. But I don't know, I don't think there really is an explanation. It really feels more like the show wanted to have a mystical, powerful kid, and didn't feel like justifying it. Same thing with him aging up 5 years. I can speculate all I want about how something the divine consciousness needed him to visit the glow again and or be older in order to ensure that Judgment Day goes the way it's supposed to, but at the end of the day, this happened because Jack Messina was getting too old too fast and they wanted to recast him. Whatever the specifics, the divine consciousness used Cal as the most direct conduit to the mortal world. That responsibility takes a real toll on Cal. The divine consciousness really put him through hell, but he did his job well, and as a reward, he's the only passenger to have his memory erased, so he has the opportunity to be a real kid this time around. A lot of people seem confused about where the plane is during the show, because it seems to show up in a whole bunch of different places. In short, after the plane first landed, it blew up, and the government took a few pieces of it to study, including the tailfin. When Sanvi killed the Major, the tailfin teleported into the ocean, because when passengers do bad things, that brings them closer to undoing their resurrection. The tailfin went from having landed in New York to having blown up and sunk in the Atlantic. Related to that, any big, dangerous supernatural things that happen during the show are usually in this same vein. When scientists do any kind of unethical testing or manipulation of the callings for personal gain, bad stuff happens. Usually earthquakes or volcanic eruptions. This is because when people do bad things, that pushes humanity closer to the apocalypse. Any events like this, the tailfin disappearing, Captain Daly's biblical plagues, etc., they're warnings that everyone better do what they're supposed to do, or else. I think I've answered all the big questions, or at least given solid possible answers. Beyond that, I could spend hours going through every episode and addressing every little weird detail that shows up, but I don't think anybody really wants that. Generally speaking, I think most smaller mysteries can be answered with the idea that the divine consciousness can see every possible future, and it did a whole bunch of little things to nudge people where they needed to go. Okay, all of that is a lot to take in, so let me summarize. In the world of Manifest, the universe is governed by an intelligent force called the divine consciousness. It wanted to test human beings to see how good they are. So it got a whole plane full of people, a large enough sample size to get a sense for how good humanity was as a whole. The plane was going to crash and kill everyone, but the divine consciousness saved them and brought them through to another plane of existence where all of time exists at once. Humans who enter this place suddenly have knowledge of the entire timeline of their lives. They understand every choice and every mistake they have ever made or will ever make. Then the divine consciousness says to them, okay, here's the deal. I'm giving you a second chance at life, but you need to be good people. After a certain amount of time, if you are good enough, you get to keep living. Otherwise, you die again. And so does the whole world. The plane got sent back to Earth, and as soon as it did, the passengers lost their memories of what they just learned. From there, the divine consciousness did everything it could to nudge the passengers towards doing the right thing and being good people. It sent them flashes of what they had learned about the future in the form of callings. It ran a few smaller versions of the test with other people nearby so that the passengers could get a sense of how the test works, what to do and what not to do. And it did 100 other little things to help guide them, too many to list here. After 5.5 years, the Judgment Day came. The group was deemed good enough, the apocalypse stopped, and the divine consciousness rewarded them by sending them back in time to the day they left with all of their future knowledge.
It's all connected.
Are you sure about that?
Okay, now it's time for me to take a little victory lap. Because did I call it, or did I call it? If you don't know, before the last season came out, I made a video predicting what all the big reveals would be, and I got a ton right. The death date was for the entire world, and not just the passengers. Called it. The callings are memories sent from the future. Called it. The show would give a vaguely religious answer for what caused everything, but leave out the specifics. Called it. The lifeboat theory was wrong. Called it.
I am too smart. I am too smart. S-M-R-T. I mean S-M-A-R-R-T.
Okay, so I got a lot of stuff wrong too. And some of what I said was in all honesty pretty vague. Combined with the lack of clear explanations in the finale of the show, it's easy to act like I predicted more than I really did. The thing I'm most annoyed about getting wrong is the Evie thing. I figured that Michaela's guilt over killing Evie would play a big part in the finale, and that she'd have to get over that trauma to succeed. And the opportunity to do that was right there. Part of the final test was learning to forgive yourself, but instead, they wrote Beverly out of the show this season, and Michaela got over her guilt in a minor subplot of an earlier episode. I don't know why they even bothered putting this plotline in the show if this was all they were going to do with it. Still, I'm proud of how much I got right. Check out that video if you're interested. The last time I talked about Manifest, I said it was the closest thing to a perfectly constructed mystery box story out there right now. It seemed like the creators learned from the mistakes of others like it, and figured out how to make a cohesive multi-season mystery. But now the ending is out, and that's the hardest part to get right. Did Manifest stick the landing? We'll see. First, the show begins with the huge opening mystery of what happened to the plane for 5.5 years. More mysteries pile on top of that as the show goes on, like the callings, and other people disappearing in similar ways, all of which stem out from that central mystery of what happened to the plane. And the show very explicitly asks the audience to speculate about the answers to these questions. At 4 seasons, I'd say Manifest is long enough for the audience to have fun picking the story apart over an extended period of time. The show does an exceptionally good job at pacing its mysteries. The big questions take the entire show to fully unfold. Plus, there are plenty of smaller mysteries in between. Since Michaela is a cop, the show ends up functioning a lot like a police procedural, with at least one small mystery per episode. Usually, what does this week's calling mean? Between those and several multi-episode and season-long mystery arcs, there's never a shortage of things to wonder about. The show has plenty of weird visuals that push the boundaries of reality, but it's clear that everything we see is really happening and has concrete consequences on the story world. So yeah, Manifest has a perfect score so far. And then we come to the ending. Judging by online discourse, reactions to the finale have been divisive. To be fair, negative reactions are generally less about the mysteries and more about the fact that the last episode rewound time and erased everything that happened in the show up to that point. And yeah, that was a bold choice. Like sure, dump everybody into the past regardless of how they might have changed since then. Wipe out the character development of every non-passenger character. Delete the existence of every baby born during the show. There's a reason why Avengers Endgame had them bring back all the people who disappeared, but changed nothing else in the timeline. The ending of Manifest is framed as a utopian happy ending, a reward for all they've been through. But almost every part of the scenario is existentially terrifying if you think about it for more than 5 seconds. But it wasn't just that. There's also been a lot of negativity towards the finale's lack of answers. From what I've seen on the Manifest subreddit, the majority of fans had already assumed that we wouldn't be getting answers and made peace with that, so it didn't bother them. But there are plenty of others who are furious that the ending left so much stuff unexplained. When I first watched the finale, I felt that way too. I was angry and frustrated at how little information the last episode gave us. I was so upset. Manifest was supposed to be the definitive mystery box story. It was supposed to learn from the mistakes of Lost and actually pay off its mysteries. How did they screw this up?
We were on the verge of greatness. We were this close.
But then, I sat down to write this video. And as I set out trying to explain all the unexplained details, going back through past episodes and collecting information, I found that we actually have way more answers than I thought we had. Stuff that I thought was confusing and nonsensical while I watched the finale ended up making a lot of sense once I had time to think about it. Most of the answers you could want are there. You just have to look for them. For example, the scene where Sanvi speculates about how the passengers were a random sample of people chosen to test humanity. Even though the show doesn't confirm that she's correct about this, the way this moment is framed very heavily implies it. We don't need the divine consciousness to show up and say, yes, this is why I chose you all. The show shouldn't have to spoon-feed us everything. Like, one of the more common questions I saw floating around online is whether Captain Daly came back to life along with all the other dead passengers. And it's like, come on, yeah, of course he did. There were 11 people who died in the glow, and 11 people missing when the plane landed. The only reason we don't see him with the others is because he's the pilot, and pilots don't walk down the tarmac. That's not how planes work. We don't need the show to tell us he survived to figure that out. Most of the important stuff is there, you just need to read between the lines. And so, I said that the ending of Manifest was good, actually. From a mystery resolving perspective, anyway. I do wish it had been more explicit about a few things. Like, I wish we had seen the passengers regain their lost memories in the glow and doubly confirm that the callings were memories. Or mention whether the divine consciousness had run other tests like this before. But overall, the ending did exactly what a mystery box ending is supposed to do. It explained a few big things, but the rest is left for the audience to put together with scattered pieces across the show. Then, was this whole story planned out in advance? Kinda. Jeff Rake has repeatedly said that he had 6 seasons planned out. Timing-wise, this makes sense. The death date was in 2024, and that's when the 6th season probably would have come out if it weren't for the cancellation and COVID delays. There's no way any of the specific details were planned out that far in advance, because that's not how TV production works. But I have to say, there aren't any big reveals that feel made up and tacked on after the fact. I assume that the writers were making stuff up as they went along, but they did a good enough job of hiding it. And finally, yes, the characters are emotionally invested in the mysteries. Pretty much everyone on the show desperately wants to find out why all this is happening to them. Heck, that's arguably Ben's defining personality trait. So many conspiracy boards. So many conspiracy boards.
Yeah, I don't think I can handle any more mystery.
Now that it's over, I can look at Manifest as a whole and say that this show accomplished everything that I hoped it would. Is it a perfect show? No. Is it a perfect mystery box story? Also no. Despite checking every box, the divisive reactions to the finale point to some more holistic issues with the overall mystery. But despite that, this is the story to which all future mystery box stories will be compared. It set up, developed, and competently paid off a massive web of questions and answers. Manifest is the first story in the history of this channel to get a final mystery box rating of 10 out of 10.
That's impossible.
As a colleague of mine told me the day you landed, I think we've taken impossible off the table.